Today's daf we're going to learn is daf Pei Bet, Eruvin Pei Bet. We're going to start at the very top. If you recall, we ended the previous daf with this discussion about general principles when Rabbi Yehuda uses a certain language in the Mishnah of Bameh or Ematai, right? Bameh Dvarim Umurim, in which case is this, right? Where there's a statement, and then he comes to qualify the statement. The question is he disagreeing or is he agreeing? So we had our Mishnah where Shmuel seemed to say he was disagreeing. It said in our Mishnah, just if you look at the top of Pei Aleph Amud Bet, She'ein marvin la'adam el mida'ato, the second line. And then, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, b'med dvarim amurim be'eruvei tchumim. The line about ein marvin la'adam el mida'ato has to be with the person's knowledge, is only about eruv tchumim, but not about eruv chatzerot. There's zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. It's always in the person's best interest, even though we kind of mentioned unless the person opens up into two different alleys, but we'll leave that aside for right now. He says, eruv chatzerot, you can always do it without their knowledge. Now, according to Shmuel, he says, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, which means that Rabbi Yehuda must disagree with Tanakama. Rabbi Yochanan ben Levi says, again, it's a general rule, not specifically here, but anytime he says, Bameh dvarim amurim Rabbi Yehuda, to Tanakama, what he's really only doing is explaining Divrei Chachamim. So now we said in the end, okay, Shmuel can disagree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Levi. He has a right to disagree. Two Amoraim, they have different approaches. No problem. We left it at that. Now we're going to start on the second line of our daf. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Levi. Kol makom she'amar Rabbi Yehuda ematai u'bameh b'mishnatenu enu ela lefaresh Divrei Chachamim. That's what we saw so far. But now we have Rabbi Yochanan omer ematai lefaresh u'bameh lachlok. He holds that when it says bameh, it's a disagreement. When it says ematai, it's lefaresh. If you look at the chart on the sheet, you'll see, I'll pull it up for a second. Right here, it's very easy to see. Right, we have ematai, everyone agrees lefaresh. Bameh, it's a distinction whether it's lefaresh or lachlok. Then you would say Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan obviously agree that in our case he's disagreeing. So now the Gemara is going to actually question where they both agree. Rabbi Yochanan ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan both agree that when it says ematai, he's coming to explain Tanakama. They're going to bring a Mishnah now, a different Mishnah, totally different context, where it says ematai. And in fact, it's actually coming, it seems, lachlok, and not lefaresh. And they both said ematai means lefaresh. So let's read. Ematai lefareshu, really? Ematai, everyone agrees that it's to explain. V'hatnan, it says in the Mishnah, a very famous Mishnah in Sanhedrin. It's famous, first of all, this sugya appears a few times, this whole discussion, and because they compare it to Nazir, and it's famous because it's about gambling, and it's just an interesting Mishnah about who is not allowed to be a witness. Elu hena psulim, these people are not trusted in court as witnesses. Hamisachek b'kubiyah, someone who is engaged in gambling. Milaveh b'ribit, someone who lends money on interest, which is forbidden by the Torah. Umefriche yonim. There's a debate about what this is. One of the opinions is it's actually very similar to gambling. It's like horse racing, so they did pigeon racing. Some people say it's something else. We'll get to all that in Sanhedrin. V'socharei shvi'it, and those people who sell their produce on the Shemitah year, which is not allowed to do. Again, there's a bit of a debate what exactly this is. But leaving all that aside, all these people, what's the issue? They're trying to make a quick buck, right? They're like, oh, let's just, I don't want to work hard, right? I'll go gamble and hopefully I'll make money. Obviously, maybe it's not the best decision, but that's irrelevant. The point is these people are out for a quick fix, which means that if someone approaches them on the street and said, would you lie falsely? I'll give you some money. They might be likely to do it. And that's why we don't want to accept them as witnesses. At least that's one of the reasons. So now we're going to say, Amar Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda appears in that Mishnah. And what does he say? The magic word, ematai. When is this the case? Now, according to what we saw by everybody, this should be explaining Tanakama. So when is this? Bizman she'en lo omanut elahi. We're not so worried if you gamble on a one-off, but if this is what you do for a living, then you're going to be a no good witness. You're not going to be disqualified as a witness. You will be disqualified as a witness. Aval yesh lo omanut shelohi harei ze kasher. If you have a nice job and you're fine, and once in a while you go to a casino because it's fun, and you figure, oh, maybe I'll make a little bit of money, that's fine. You're not disqualified as being a witness. Okay? And the idea is, the Gemara there says, it's because you're eino osek b'yishuvo shel olam, right? You're not involved in, pru revu v'kivshu et haaretz, in kind of filling up the world with productive things, and you're just kind of looking for a quick fix. This is how you make your money. Okay, it's not, if you're doing it one-off, it's fine. But if this is how you make your money and you're not really interested in Yishuvot Shel Olam, then you're going to end up basically, probably taking money for lying falsely. So far, we're going to assume, based on what everybody said, that Rabbi Yehuda Tanna Kama doesn't disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. Everybody agrees that it's only if this is your only job. That's all you do, or you don't have a job, and all you do is gamble or lend money on interest, right? That's your job. So now, Tani ala bebraita says in a braita, though, Chachamim omrim, ben she'en lo manut elahi, uben she'esh lo manut shelo. We actually think it's a Tosefta there, if I remember correctly. Harei ze pasul. Okay, so now they say, but the rabbis disagree, and it appears in the Tosefta that whether you have an omanut or whether you don't, it doesn't matter. If you gamble, you're pasula edut. You can't testify. Okay, so what do you see here? The rabbis do disagree. So since the rabbis disagree, what do you see? It must be those same rabbis that are disagreeing in the Mishnah that we quoted. So ematai must be to disagree. So what do they answer? Hahi de Rabbi Yehuda amar Rabbi Tarfon hi. Don't worry. Where it says Chachamim Omrim, it's not really Chachamim Omrim. It's actually Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfon. Okay? Which means, it's a little strange, but they take Chachamim and they say, we're basically going to say there's two different things going on here. Our Mishnah starts off with Tanna Kama. Rabbi Yehuda comes to explain Tanna Kama. That's the general main opinion. Then Rabbi Yehuda quotes elsewhere in this Braita or Tosefta, he quotes Chachamim Omrim, and he's really not quoting the rabbis. It's really Rabbi Yehuda saying it in the name of Rabbi Tarfon. Now, it's a little strange. It doesn't say there, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Tarfon. So where do we get this from? Well, they get it from a different source. This is, I think, maybe where I got confused. Maybe this one's in the Tosefta, but I'm not sure. I definitely remember there being a Tosefta there somewhere. Did Tanya. Amar Rabbi Yehuda mishum Rabbi Tarfon, la'olam ein echad mehem nazir lefi she'ein nazirut ela lahafla'a. Now we have a different source. This is interesting. This is, the Gemara doesn't tell you very much, but if you look in Rashi tells you the details here. Ein echad mehem nazir. What's the case? All you're told here is none of them become a nazir because nazirut needs hafla'ah, which means an expression of clarity. Okay? Now, what does that mean? What's the case? So Rashi says, Shnaim sheyoshvim v'ra'u achad ba v'amar echad mehem. We're about 8 lines from before the Gemara in Rashi. Before the next parak, I mean. Shnaim sheyoshvim v'ra'u achad ba. So 2 people were sitting on the street, you and me, and we see somebody walking by in the street, and I say, Amar echad mehem, hareini nazir shezeh nazir. I swear that person's a nazir. I know he's a nazir, and I'm going to be a nazir. If I'm right, I'm going to be a nazir. V'amar chavero, hareini nazir she'ein zeh nazir. I swear this person isn't a nazir, and I'm going to be a nazir if he's not a nazir. In other words, I know I'm so right that I'm betting you. Okay, and the bet is I'll become a nazir. So they're betting. You can see this is very similar. This idea of betting, right, just like in a casino. So what do they say? Now, obviously, the person is either a nazir or not a nazir. So one of us, right, now let's say we find out. Let's say we don't find out. Okay, so I don't know. But let's say we find out that the person was a nazir. And I said, I'm going to be a nazir if that person's a nazir. I do not become a nazir. Why? Because ein nazirut ela lahafla. That means, it says in the pasuk, ki yafli lindor neder nazir. When you express with words to become a nazir. So they learn that word to express has to be a clear expression. Now, this was not a clear expression. I was betting. Right? How many times do you say, I bet that's going to be, I promise I'll do this, or more like your kids, right? You might say, if you do this, I'll give you something, right? I'll promise you a trip to America or a trip to Israel, or, and we don't really mean it, right? We're just trying to tell them we really want you to do this. I was really just trying to say, I know I'm right. I didn't really mean to become a nazir. In order to become a nazir, you have to know that you really want to do it. It doesn't work otherwise. So, since when I said it, it wasn't clear that I was going to definitely be a nazir or not. Lo mishabed nafshe. I didn't really mean it. Okay, when I said I didn't really mean what I said. What does this have to do with gambling? Hachanami. Likewise here, kevan de lo yada ikane ilo kane lo gamar umakne. When I put money down and I buy chips in a casino, what's my intent? What do I want to do when I go to a casino? I have one intent in mind generally. I want to make money. That's why I'm there. So when I put down money, I'm not really seriously putting down the money. I don't really want to lose that money. I'm planning to keep that money and gain more. So now I might be wrong about that because I'll probably lose, but my goal is to make money there. I don't really seriously think that I'm going to lose my money. So therefore, there's no kinyan here. We're lacking. We talked about kinyan yesterday. There's no real acquisition of money. I never really put the money down. Because I never really put the money down, I now, and let's put it this way, the people who own the casino certainly don't want to be giving me their money, right? They're hoping to give me their money so that I'll give it back to them. So they don't really give me money, which means that if I walk out with money, I'm basically walking out with stolen money. It's not mine. This is what we call in halacha asmachta. And asmachta lo kanya. Okay, there's a whole book written about asmachta. There's a lot of different opinions about this. We'll deal with it more when we get to Sanhedrin, where it's really the core sugya is there. But the idea being, anyone who gambles is pasula edu because they're walking around with stolen money. They steal people's money, basically. By you going to a casino, you're basically stealing money because nobody really intended to give you that money. So therefore, you don't really own it. And therefore, you're a robber. And anyone who steals money is obviously suspect that they're going to be lying falsely for money, because if you steal money, so you'll also take money to swear falsely. So therefore, what was this all to prove? That opinion of the Chachamim in that breira was really Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Tarfon, just like he says it in Nizirut, he would say it here, and therefore it's a one-off opinion. It doesn't ruin Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi's principle of every time, and also Rabbi Yochanan's, every time Rabbi Yehuda says a matai, it's to explain and not that he disagrees. So there is a disagreement, but not in that Mishnah. Hadran al-Chalon, and now we're moving to the next parak. We're going to have a very similar Mishnah to what we just had. We talked about how do you do shituf mefo'ot. Now we're going to say how do you do shituf tchumin. Now you might say, shituf tchumin, never heard of shituf tchumin, right? Tchumin is I put an eruv for myself. So hold off and we'll explain in a minute. Ketzad mishtatfim b'tchumin. Meniach et hachavit, I put down a barrel of wine, just for an example. Ve'omer harei ze l'chol b'nei iri. I can say I'm doing an eruv for my entire city. Now this is strange. How can you do an eruv for the whole city? Remember, you're messing people up. People might not want their eruv to be there. They might want to go the other direction. But how does it work? And that's what shituf tchumim means. It means someone can do a tchum on behalf of other people. So I say, this is for anyone in my city. Anybody who wants to go to visit someone who's an avelut, someone who lost a loved one, or going to some sort of celebration. Right? Obviously, people aren't really having parties on Shabbat, but let's say someone got married that week and they were having Sheva brachot. And also avelut, we don't really generally do Shiva visits on Shabbat, but I guess you want to visit the person who is an avelut. So now, it doesn't work just because I said it. It's potentially there for anybody who wants. Anyone who decided before Shabbat started, they want to use my eruv, mutar, they can go wherever they want based on my eruv. Misha techshach, but if they decided once it was dark, they want to rely on my eruv, asur she'em ma'arvim misha techshach. Then it's forbidden because you can't put an eruv up once it's dark. So first of all, I remember seeing, I researched a few weeks ago, I can't find it now, but I remember seeing that there's something in Israel that you can join an eruv tchumin. They have eruv tchumins up, and you can kind of call up before Shabbat and say, I want to join. This is basically based on this Mishnah. I couldn't find it, but what I did find this morning, which was interesting, that I wanted to tell people, if your Hebrew's good, on the Moatzah Datit side of Hod HaSharon, they have pictures of all the eruv around, and they explain based on halacha all the different parts of the eruv and different things. So it's a worthwhile site to go to. If you look up the Moatzah Datit of Hod HaSharon and you look up eruv there on their site, you can find a whole description with pictures of the eruv, and I thought it was really interesting to read. Okay, now, the first thing they're going to deal with is the fact that I can only do this from before Shabbat. I have to say it before Shabbat. So Amar Rav Yosef, that's not the first thing. That'll be the second thing, my mistake. Amar Rav Yosef, Ein ma'arvin ela lidvar mitzvah. So the first thing is we're going to talk about, we talked about this before, we saw there was a machloket, can you do an eruv only for a mitzvah or not? So now we kind of just saw references to it, but here he says directly, you can only do eruv tchumin for dvar mitzvah. Some people quote this the halacha, that really you can't just do eruv tchumin for any reason, it has to be like our Mishnah. Go to a beit avel, go to a beit mishteh, something along those lines, or something more of a mitzvah you might think. So, Gemara says, my kamashmalan, why are you telling us this? Tanina, lechomi she'elech lebeit avel or lebeit mishteh. It says in the Mishnah, anyone who goes to the beit avel or to the beit mishteh. So you have it explicit in our Mishnah that it's only for a mitzvah. So they say, no, you can't necessarily infer from our Mishnah that it's only those cases, because you could say, Ma'u detema orcha demota katane kamash malan. You might have thought the Mishnah is just telling you some examples, but it doesn't mean only those reasons. So Rabbi Yochanan says, really, those are the reasons, the main reasons only. Now, they say, Kol shekibel alav mi ba'od yom. So now we're going to go to what I said we were going to go to, which is, if you accept it mi ba'od yom. So shmat mina, ein breira. Back to our breira, which keeps coming up over and over again. This sounds like you can't retroactively designate something, right? If you designate it on Shabbat, you can't say, oh, well, that proves that was my intention from before Shabbat, because here you have to say I'm part of the eruv before Shabbat starts, not when Shabbat already started. So the yesh breira, if we held by breira that retroactive designation works, then tigali milton lemafreya dimi ba'od yom havani chale. Then when I decide on Shabbat, remember that whole sugya about if my rabbi is coming that way or my rabbi is coming that way, and then you can decide on Shabbat or you can't decide on Shabbat. So here we're going to say, it looks like from this Mishnah that there is no breira, because if there was breira, we would allow you even to decide on Shabbat. And then we could say, retroactively, it shows that that's really what I intended from before Shabbat, and that should be fine. So the fact that we don't allow that is proof. So Amar Rav Ashi, no, not necessarily. You could say hodi'u velo hodi'uhu katani. Really, when our Mishnah says, if you accept it miba'od yom, it doesn't really mean if you accept it miba'od yom. What has to happen before miba'od yom? You really can accept it on Shabbat, because yesh breira. You can decide, I want to be part of your eruv tchumen on Shabbat. However, what has to be done before Shabbat? I have to know of the existence of the eruv tchumen. If I found out on Shabbat, let's say I want to go to a neighboring city that I can't get to from where I live, and it's outside of my tchum, and I didn't even know there was such a thing as eruv tchumen, and that someone had put one up, and then I find out on Shabbat that someone put up an eruv tchumen and I can rely on it, that doesn't work. Then we can't say, yesh breira, that was clearly what I wanted before Shabbat, because I didn't even know if the possibility existed before Shabbat. But if I knew the possibility existed, I knew there was an eruv and I could have relied on it, I just didn't say anything. When I decide later, we can assume that must have been my intent from before Shabbat, even if it wasn't, by the way. That's how retroactive designation works. It's as if I kind of decided before. So Rav Ashi says this doesn't prove anything about whether yesh breira or ein breira. It could go both ways. Amar Rav Asi. Now we're going to go into another very interesting issue. Katan ben shesh yotzei be'eruv imo. What does this mean? Let's say he can't be yotzei be'eruv imo. What would that mean? It would mean that the mother, she does an eruv. She also has to include, we're going to see later today, that you have to put food down, a certain amount of food. She'd have to put food down for herself and for her son, separate amount of food, and she'd have to be mizakeoto. She'd have to say, I'm putting this on your behalf. Okay? She would have to do that if he wasn't yotzei her eruv. So now we say up until the age of 6, or a 6-year-old and under, can still be yotzei the eruv as a mother. This is very logical. A little kid, right? We all know this is, anyone who's a mother of little children, generally, unless you have a lot of help in the house, wherever you go, the kid goes, right? You don't have your own freedom anymore once you have a kid. Wherever you're going, the kid's going, therefore it makes perfect sense. If I put my own eruv, so of course, I didn't only think about myself, I thought about my kid up until age 6, because wherever I'm going, my kid is going, and therefore they're basically connected. So that's what it says. Now, what's the other relevance of this ben shesh? This is the really interesting part. According to halacha, okay, this you see it here, and it comes up in other sugyot. Children under the age 6 go with the mother. From age 6, what happens? Their father's in charge. Why? Age 6 is age of education. And those days, right, the father was in charge of educating the child. And therefore, from age 6, it's the father's responsibility. Why is this so important? Well, halachic laws, if you go to a Beit Din and you have custody issues, generally the Beit Din Rabbani, fascinating, will side on the father once the children are above the age of 6 based on halacha. Okay, if you take it to a regular civil court, the civil court will generally favor custody to the mother in many situations, right? There's, or at least equally. But in halachic courts, okay, and this is a thing, like in Israel, by the way, you can open a tik in the Beit Din for custody or in the regular courts or in the Beit Din Rabbani and the rabbinic courts. And if the husband wants custody, he'll be smart and he'll try to open the file in the Beit Din Rabbani in order to get custody rights, because he knows that they'll more favor him over the mother. Obviously, they take other factors into consideration, but this is a very important thing, this age 6. Okay, not just for eruv, which we think isn't so relevant, but it's very, very important and a little problematic nowadays. Okay, so katan ben shesh yotzei be'eruv imo. So now we're going to have a problem with this. Meitive, they bring the following source to contradict. Katan shetzarich li'imo yotzei be'eruv imo. Fascinating line. How do we determine things? This, by the way, supports, we've seen this before, that at age 13 or age 12, we call a child, you're bar mitzvah, you're bat mitzvah, now you're chayav mitzvah. In rabbinic laws, it was not the case. It was not so, especially in the time of the Mishnah. It was very fluid. Different mitzvot have different ages of what we call reaching the age of chinuch, of when you're obligated in certain things. So, according to this, if you need your mother, okay, that's a very, very funny line, right? Some kids are 25 and need their mothers. If you need your mother, yotzei be'eruv imo, v'she'ein tzarich li'imo, ein yotzei be'eruv imo. It all depends on how much you're in need of the mother. Utna nami, we haven't finished the question yet. It also says in the Mishnah, gabe sukkah, same thing by sukkah. Ki agavna, the same thing. Katan she'ein tzarich li'imo chayav b'sukkah. This makes a lot of sense also. If you don't need your mother, then you can go in the sukkah, because generally the mother's weren't in the sukkah, and you can separate them from the mother and go sleep in the sukkah. V'havina ba, and they asked, Ezu katan she'ein tzarich li'imo. How would you define this? So this was a Tannaitic source. Now they ask the Amoraim. Amri debei Rabbi Yanai, from the house of Rabbi Yanai, they say, Kol shenifneh ve'eni mo mekanachto. If you go to the bath and the mother doesn't need to wipe the child. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish omer, Kol shenei or ve'eno korei ima. If the child wakes up and doesn't call ima. So, ima sakadatach? What do you mean the child doesn't call ima? Gdolim nami karu. What do you mean? Older kids also call their mother. That's kind of like what I said before, right? People always, you're sick. What do? You immediately want your mother, right? Until you get to a certain age. But still, even at an older age, people are still doing that. Ela ema, so wait, fix it to kol shenei or mishnato ve'eno korei ima ima. Okay, this always happened in my house with little kids, right? First thing they wake up in the morning, ima, ima, right? That scream from the bed, like, come, I need you. So that's what we're talking a katan that needs a mother. That you can't even wake up in the morning without feeling like you need your mother by your side. So, obviously, nowadays, sometimes my kids would call Abba, Abba, right? It's not always Ima, Ima. That's another thing to think about the sugya, right? Even though I was kind of siding on the custody side of the mother, obviously there's room to also be supporting the father in various cases, not so clear-cut either way. But in any case, so now they say, Vikama. So how much is that? What age does generally a kid not need their mother to wipe them, or when they wake up in the morning? Kebar arba, kebar chamesh. So first of all, it's not an exact age. We know that, right? You look at all those kids' books of development, right? It's all arranged. Even the rabbis understood that. Around 4 or 5, but not 6. This says if you're still 6, you still go with your mother. So here we have a contradiction, and there it specifically said eruv. So Amar Rav Yeshua b'rei Rav Idi, Kika Amar Rav Asi, Kigon she'erev alav aviv l'tzafon v'imo l'darom. Ta'afilu bar shesh nami b'tzavta di'imei nichale. We're going to distinguish. We're going to say, okay, maybe I'll pull up the chart here. When you have, here. Okay, so Rav Asi said it's shesh, and the Breita and the Mishnah and Sukkah and Rabbi Yanai and Rish Lakish all said 4 or 5, right? That's how they defined all those answers. So we said, let's start with the Breita and all the Mishnah and Sukkah and all that. That's when the mother, at age 4 or 5 already, the kid is somewhat independent. If the mother wants to include the kid in the eruv, the mother has to add food and do a zichiyah. First of all, she can't be mizakehim, he's a katan, so she would have to take someone else and say, listen, I want you to accept it on his behalf. Just like we saw in our Mishnah, you have to accept it. So somehow there has to be some acceptance of the child. That's 4 or 5. But what if there's a case, and this is kind of like the custody laws, where the father did it for the child to the north, and the mother did it for the child to the south? Now where does the child go? So until age 6, and this matches exactly what I talked about, the way halacha views custody, is the child goes with the mother till age 6, or including age 6, it sounds like, because he said even katan ben shesh, and after age 6, the father. So when there's a conflict, that's what Rav Asi was discussing. Okay, so that's different than what we were saying before. Okay? But still what we would have to do is the mother would have to include the child in her eruv, even starting at age 4 or 5. Okay? So I see Eva asked the question, and I specifically didn't mention this because I really don't recall all the laws about it, whether the man is only responsible for the male children from the age of 6 and not the female children. And I'm sorry that I forgot to look that up and didn't remember exactly. So it's a very good question, something someone can look up and check it out. I really can't remember, sorry. Okay, so now, Meitive. But now we're going to have a question on this. So Rabbi Yeshua basically answers, that's his answer, but now we question this. Katan shetzarich limo, we bring the source, it says, a katan shetzarich limo yotze be'eruv imo ad ben shesh. Okay, now we're going to basically say this doesn't match anything. But first we're going to start and say, Tiyufta de Rabbi Yeshua bar Rav Idi. This exactly goes against what we just said a minute ago. We said that 4 or 5 already you'd need to be part, the mother would have to make the child a separate eruv. And this says until 6. Sounds like not 4 or 5, but until 6 he's part of her eruv. So they say, in fact, Tiyufta de Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Yeshua bar Rav Idi Tiyufta. This is in fact a question for him. But now the Gemara says, why did you only raise this source as a question on him? This source actually questions all of the opinions that we read. Lema tavi tiyufta de Ravasi. Because Ravasi said, Ben Shesh still doesn't need his mother, and this says until 6. So Amalacha Ravasi, he can answer Ab Abichlal. Ad means up into and including. So up into and including 6, the mother can include this, the mother doesn't need to do anything separate. So that explains Ravasi. They said 4 or 5, so this says up till 6. So lo kashya ha de ite avue b'mata ha de lo ite avue b'mata. This is interesting. If the father's not in the city, then it's until 6. If the father's in the city and basically there's an alternative, then we're going to already say the child's not necessarily as connected to its mother, but it might begin to be more connected to the father, and then we'd have to basically say if the mother wants to include the child in the eruv, the mother has to add. So it depends on how. It's very interesting because you could say in the city, but maybe it actually, right, in modern day you would say how involved the father is, right? We know there's families where fathers are not necessarily around and the children are very attached to the mother until a later age, right? And then sometimes when they get older, they have more to do with the father and then they become less attached to the mother. But in some families, the father's around all the time and very involved, and the child might favor the father even at a young age. So at that age, basically 4 or 5, if the father's around, and then we're already it's not going to be so clear the child's going to want to always go where the mother goes. Because again, this isn't a halachic thing necessarily, even though they use halachic things like the 6, but it's not necessarily halachic. It's kind of wherever the mother goes, is that where the kid is going or not? Okay, now we're moving on topics. Tanu Rabbanan. מערב אדם על ידי בנו וביתו הקטנים ועל ידי עבדו ושפחתו הכנעניים בין לדעתן בין שלא לדעתן. Okay, the al yedei is a bit of a strange usage of words. Al yedei usually means by the way of, meaning they can do it for him, but that's not what we're talking about. Last time we talked about them, these categories very recently, it was can they be mizakeh, right? Can they basically give rights to people, say I'll accept rights of ownership for them. But here we're talking about if I'm going to put an eruv for them, can I do it without them knowing? So if it's a person's eved or shivcha knani, Canaanite slaves, or young children, then whether they know about it, whether they don't, he's allowed to do the eruv for them. But when it comes to Jewish slaves, or, right, that's someone, by the way, I didn't mention it last time it came up, but we've talked already a number of times about Canaanite slaves. If you missed that shir and you don't know it, so you can look back, look it up. But now I'll just mention about Ivri slaves. What does that mean? It's someone who couldn't pay back something. Let's say I stole money and I couldn't pay it back, so you could get sold into slavery. Okay, for a male, it's usually they did something like that. For a female, it's often the father can afford to keep the daughter and sells her into slavery until she gets of age. Once she's of marriageable age, then either the master marries her, the son marries her, or they basically sell. She goes free. Right? There's a whole thing about what she does. I'm not going to get into all the details, but anyway. What happens? So, all these people aren't part of his eruv. He can't do it. He can't do an eruv techimum for them without their knowledge. So, not David Ivri, not the older children, and not for the wife either. Very interesting. Sugya basically shows how the wife has her own independent ideas of where she wants to go on Shabbat, right? As opposed to the child, which always goes with the mother. There wasn't this assumption that the wife always goes with the husband, even though sometimes we say ish tokigufo, right? She's like him. Here, they're separate. Elamidatam. It has to be with their knowledge. Tanya Idach, a different breira says, okay, it's going to start with the end and move to the beginning, and that's going to be the reverse order. Lo ya'arev adam al yedei beno bito gdolim v'al yedei avdo v'shivchato ivrim v'lo al yedei ishto elamidatam. That's the exact same thing we just said at the end. אבל מערב הוא על ידי עבדו ושכתו הקטנים ועל ידי בני ביתו הקטנים בין לדעתם בין שלא לדעתם. So far that was a just exact quote. I'm not going to even repeat it. But now they say, why can he do it for the young children and the slaves that are Canaanite slaves? מפני שידן כי ידו, because they don't have their own independent legal entity. Whatever they, like money-wise, their money, whatever money they get, goes straight to the father. And therefore, anything that they do is really to the father. So therefore, if he can make an eruv on their behalf without their knowledge or without their consent. V'kulan she'eruvu. Now we have this bit of a strange line. All of those that he makes an eruv for, if they made their own eruv, v'irev alehem. What if they made their own eruv and he made an eruv for them in different directions? Rabban, v'irev alehem rabban, whether it's the father or the owner, whatever he is, yotzim b'shel rabban. Then they go by his. Okay, this seems to contradict what we just said, but chutz min ha'isha. Except for the woman. She's the one exception. Because she can say, I don't want to go where you put my eruv. Now, this is a little strange. Why only the woman? Right? What about all the beno hagdolim? Right? Until now, we said he can only do it with their knowledge. What if they did somewhere else? So the Gemara is going to say, Isha ma'ishna. Why is she any different than the rest of them in her category? It means the woman and all those in that category. Meaning, if a child or an Eved Knani, a Canaanite slave, made their own eruv and the Adon made an eruv, we're going to go by the Adon. If the wife or the older children or the Jewish slave made an eruv and the Adon made an eruv, then we don't go by his, we go by theirs. That's basically what it said. Now, they're going to say, wait a minute, Amar, we just said a minute ago, chutz min ha'isha mipnei shechola limchot. So because she can protest, Tama demache, it sounds like because she protests, hastama nafka b'debala. It sounds like though if she doesn't protest, then it would go by her husband. But didn't we just say haktana reisha elamidatam? You need their knowledge. We're going to basically say there's three options: either she agrees, or she doesn't say anything, or she protests. So we just said protest is going to go by her. But it sounds like if she just doesn't say anything, then she would go by his. But that doesn't seem to make sense because that's not mida'atam, right? If they're just silent, that doesn't mean it's... So, my lav da'amre in, isn't it that they said, right, that they agree? No. My elam mida'atam di'ishtiku. No. Mida'atam doesn't necessarily mean that they consented, right? It's a big debate. We saw this before. What is mida'atam or lo mida'atam? So, when we say with their knowledge, it could mean that they were silent. And then really, right, it would go by them. Lafuke hechad amre lo. That excludes, right? Sorry, if they're silent, right? He could do it either with their consent, or even if they're silent, he can do it on their behalf. Only if they protest does it go by them. This is limiting their independence. So now they say, but wait a minute. V'kulan she'eruvu v'yerev alehem rabban yotzim b'shel rabban v'stamahu. But wait, it says in that breira, anyone who does an eruv, if they did an eruv and he did an eruv, they're yotze. And here it's with stam. They didn't, put up big protest signs, right? I'm thinking I drive around the streets and all you see are people protesting in the streets here in Israel all over, right? It's not like they were holding up picket signs, I'm not interested, right? So they say, it sounds like it's a stam case. And what does it say? Katane chutz min ha'isha delo nafke, and it excludes the women. This is basically saying the woman doesn't, right? If she made her own eruv and he made an eruv, even though she didn't protest his eruv, we still go by her. So the Gemara says the obvious, which is Amarava, Kevan she'irvu ein lecha michoy gadol mizeh. What more protest do you want? You don't have to be holding up picket signs. Your actions show that you're protesting. The fact that she made her own eruv shows that she disagrees with his eruv. That's protesting. So basically, interestingly, the Gemara limits it. It basically says if she protests, which she could do not necessarily by making a big protest, but by making her own eruv and showing I'm not interested in your eruv, then she gets her own eruv. Otherwise, if he makes an eruv for her and she doesn't consent but she doesn't disagree, then we're going to assume his eruv goes for her, which makes sense in the sense of the Gemara, again, viewing this hierarchy of the men kind of, the women follow the men. It kind of makes sense that they limited it a little bit. Okay, now we're getting into, I would say, part of this is a little complicated. I tried to simplify it for you so that, and this leads into tomorrow's daf, which also is complicated, but I'll hopefully give you the building blocks so that you'll be able to understand it if you're not listening to the shiur for tomorrow, and you want to do it on your own on Shabbat. So here goes. The beginning of this mishna is pretty easy, but then it's going to get a little bit complicated. We're back to mathematics. Kama hu shiuro, mazon shte seudot l'chol echad ve'echad. So what's the shiur? For how much do you need eruv tchumen? It's a little unclear, the structure of this mishna, but it actually kind of seems like there's 4 opinions here, okay? Or it's either 2 and 2, or maybe they're really 4 altogether. What's mazon shtei sudo for everybody that you're making the eruv for? So mizono, l'chol v'lo l'shabbat. Well, there's different meals on Shabbat and chol. We all know you make a lunch for a regular day, you eat a little bit of food. When you make lunch on Shabbat, you have a huge meal. So it's the amount of food you need for a regular day. Even though you're doing your eruv on Shabbat, it goes by a regular day's meal. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda omer l'Shabbat v'lo l'chol. So no, a Shabbat meal. Now you might think Rabbi Yehuda is being machmir that you need a lot more food, but the Gemara tells us, I don't know if you remember this, but we mentioned this when we learned about Sudash Lishit and Shabbat Kuf Yud Chet. It says v'zeh mizeh v'mitkavnim lahakel. Both of them are lenient. What's their disagreement about? It's a great disagreement. Are the meals on Shabbat larger than normal, or are they smaller? And Rabbi Yehuda had an opinion that everybody ate smaller meals, and we talked about it then. That to eat 3 meals a day was difficult. Like we eat 3 meals a day all the time. Some people even 5 meals a day, right? Smaller meals. But in those days, they ate 2 big meals, and that was their food. So to add in a 3rd meal, you actually have to make your meals smaller. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to eat 3 full meals. And the idea, as the Avudraham quotes this, the idea is to limit how much you eat on Shabbat so that you're not overeating. And you should focus your energies on Shabbat on other things like learning and not eating. Right? Very different from what many of us do. Anyway, there you see the source for it is Rabbi Yehuda, who thought that on Shabbat we actually eat smaller meals. So each of them thinks it's a smaller amount. It's just a matter of, is the smaller amount what you eat on Shabbat or what you eat on a regular day? That wasn't the complicated part yet. Here it comes. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka omer. So now it seems like they're giving a different opinion. They each say it's a meal, or maybe they're defining what is that meal. Maybe that's part of the issue. It's unclear 100%. Now we want to know what's the size of the 2 meals. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka omer, mikikar b'punyon me'arba se'im b'sela. Okay, 5 words that are kind of complicated. What does this mean? The size of 2 meals. Okay, I'm going to pull up my sheet. It'll help you organize. Okay. A kikar b'punyon, it's the size of a roll, like a loaf of bread, that you would buy for a punyon when it's 4 se'im for a sela in the shuk. When the market price is, you can buy 4 se'im of flour for a sela. Okay, how do we do this? So 4 se'ah is 24 kav. Okay, 24 kabim. Okay, that's a measurement of volume. We want to eventually get to kav, which is going to translate into beitzim, and then talk about how many beitzim or how many kavim we have. A punyon is 1/48 of a sela. So I'm going to try to make this as very simple as possible. If a punyon is 1/48 of a sela, and a sela buys you 24 kav, so divide 24 by 48, and you get half. So basically, your size of your kikar is going to be a half a kav. That's how much flour is in your kikar. Now, if a kikar is half a kav, I'm just going along in my sheet here. If a kikar is half a kav is 12 beitzim, 12 eggs, okay? That's because a whole kav is 24, so half is 12. So they now say the shiur for 2 meals is a kikar, which is 12 eggs, okay? That's our shiur, which would also mean, and we'll get back to this shiur, and that's why I want to say it, he's defining 2 things in the kikar. Number 1, what is the size of an average loaf? And an average loaf is shiur of shtei seudot, okay, and that's a half a kav, 12 eggs. 1 meal would then be a quarter of a kav, half of that 6 beitzim, okay. Now, Rabbi Shimon says, let's look in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon omer shtei yadot lekikar mishalish lekav. Okay, the first thing he disagrees about is the size of a kikar. He says the size of a loaf is not a half a kav, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka just concluded. He says the size of a loaf is a third of a kav. That's his first point of disagreement. You have to really separate these 2 things, otherwise you'll get very confused as we go on. One is, what's the size of a loaf? And second of all, what's our shiur of 2 seudot? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, they were one and the same. A loaf is the shiur for 2 meals. According to Rabbi Shimon, the shiur for 2 meals is shtei yadot lekikar mishlish kav. What does that mean? It's 2 parts, meaning 2 out of 3 parts, meaning 2/3, okay, in our simple language. 2/3 of this kikar. Now the kikar is a third of a kav. So the shiur of shtei seudot is 2/3 of this kikar, which will come out to 2/9 of a kav. So basically, we're going to say his loaf is 1/3 of a kav, which isn't so different from Rabbi Yochanan and Broka's loaf. It's different, but one is half, one is 1/3. But the shear of 2 meals, according to Rabbi Shimon, is 2/3 of that amount. So it's 2/9 of a kav. Okay, which comes out to, I did the math here, a kav is 24, a kikar is 8. Shtei seudot would be 5.34 beitzim as opposed to 12 beitzim, right? So your 2 seudot are 5.34 beitzim, and your 1 meal is half of that, 1/9 of a kav. Okay, so you see, and now that's going to be the number we're going to need in a minute or two, which is the difference. Okay, soon later. Actually, I'll stop there and I'll say it as we get there. So now the Mishnah says, okay, the first thing the Mishnah is dealing with is going to be the size of a loaf. Okay, the size, again, they differ on the size of a loaf, half or 1/3 of a kav, and they differ on the size of mazon shtei seudot, either, right, half a kav or 1/9 of a kav. So now, or 2/9 of a kav, right, or 1 suda, a quarter versus 1/9. So now they're going to say that shear of a kikar, whether a kikar, that when we talk about a standard loaf, is a standard loaf 1/3 of a kav or half of a kav, that's used for 2 other shirim. Chetziah l'bayit hamenuga, v'chetzi chetziah l'fsol etagviyah. These are 2 types of tumah. When you walk into a house that is a leprous house, you basically, when you walk in, you become tameh, but your clothes only become tameh that you're wearing when you've stayed in the house enough to eat a half a pras. How do we determine the size? It's based on, the size there is based on this size of a kikar. Again, there's actually 2 ways to understand it. Some people say the kikar that Rabbi Shimon was talking about, and some people say no, it's the debate between them about what the size of a kikar is. And lifsolet hakviyah is when you're eating truma, you become tameh, and because they were worried that maybe you drink something at the same time, if you remember this. So it's, what's the size there? It's chetzi chetzia lifsolet hakviyah. It's the quarter of that size. Okay, we'll get to that in the Gemara tomorrow. But now they're going to say, so now the Mishnah says, okay, wait. The Gemara says, okay, you've given us some things, but really, how much is mazon shtei seudot, like in our terminology? Bring it down to life for us. Am Rav Yehuda Marav, tarte rifta ikariyata, 2 loaves of the farmer. Rav Ad bar Av Amar, tarte rifta nahar papiyata, 2 loaves of the way they eat them in nahar papiyata. It's like me saying, like the bakery on Sheshet Hayamim, right? The size that their bread is, something like that, okay? You know, like I would just give an example of a local bakery. That's what they're saying. Amar le Rav Yosef Berei de Rabba, avuch keman sfirale, ke Rabbi Meir, sfirale. So he says, who does your father hold by? So he says, like Rabbi Meir. And he says, ananami ke Rabbi Meir sfirale, and that machlok at Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and this is, I guess, why we eat a lot of food on Shabbat. He says, basically, I hold like Rabbi Meir that we eat more food on Shabbat than on a regular day. Tika Rabbi Yehuda, kashya, and here's a great line. If you hold like Rabbi Yehuda, it's difficult, because hadam re'inche, rav chalivasima shachiach. We always have room for, this is either dessert, comes up in Megillah when they talk about sweet foods. Basically, you always have room for delicacies, right? When you're eating yummy food, you can eat way more than normally. So that's why on Shabbat we eat the nicer food, and that's why there's always room for more, and that's why we eat more on Shabbat than on any other day. Okay, now, end part for today, and I'll like I said, once you view this chart and the way I did the math here, it should be fairly simple, because at this point, the sugya is going to be based on 1 meal is 1/4 of a kav according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, and 1 meal according to Rabbi Shimon is 1/9 of a kav, which gets us to the fact how many seudot in a kav. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, there's 4 meals to a kav. According to Rabbi Shimon, there's 9 meals to a kav. So the Gemara says, Tana ukrovim divrehem liot shavim. They're actually very similar, these 2 approaches. So the Gemara says, how could you possibly say these 2 are very similar sizes? Midame. Do Rabbi Yochanan arba seudat lekav. To Rabbi Shimon tesha seudat lekav. What do you mean? One says it's 4 meals to a kav, and the other says it's 9 meals to a kav. That's a huge difference. So Amar Rav Chisda, wait. The number that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka did included the profit margin, the markup of the seller, which means, okay, now you have to get the math here. How much? Shlish l'chemvani. According to Rav Chisda, the chemvani, the store owner, raises his price by 1/3, which means that instead of getting a pundion is 1/48 of a sela, so instead of getting the amount, you're now going to have 1/72 of a sela. In other words, he's going to raise his price by 1/3, so you get from 48 to 72. So you're going to basically have to pay, right? Your pundion now can get you a value of 1/72 of a sela, and not 1/48, because you have to include the profit margin, which means that you take 24, instead of dividing by 48, you divide it by 72. You get 1/3 is 2 meals, which means 1 meal will be half of that, which is 1/6 of a kav. So now they say, well, that didn't help us. Akarte lemar tisha ulemar shit. That only got us to 6 versus 9. They're still kind of far off. Still, he says there's 6 meals in a kav. So they say, Ela ki'id after Rav Chisda damar. Oh, wait, but there's a different statement of Rav Chisda who says, the markup is a half, not a third. Okay, right? Think about business, right? Some people mark up profit margins very high. So if you do a half, then instead of 48, you have 96. Instead of, right, you get down to a quarter, okay, 24 over 96 is a quarter. You get to 2 meals is a quarter of a kav, which means 1 meal is an eighth. Now we're already much closer. But still, the Gemara says, Akarta the Martesho the Martim. It's still 8 versus 9. They say, well, that's exactly why it says, Hainu Tekamaru Krovim Divrehem Liot Shavim. They're similar. They're close, but they're not. In other words, they're not as far off as you think, because Rabbi Yochanan includes this issue of the profit margin. But now they say, wait a minute, last line for today. Kasha Rav Chisda, we just said, according to Rav Chisda, the profit margin is a third. The profit markup is a third. According to Rav Chisda the second time, the markup is a half. How could that be? So they say, Lo kash yahadi kayav balabayit sive, hada lo kayav balabayit sive. If the balabayit provides some of the raw ingredients, if he provides the twigs for making the fire, then the profit margin is going to be, the markup is going to be lower, right? This is classic, right? If you do part of it, then they'll charge you less, right? So they won't. So basically, it depends on the situation how much he marks up the price, depending on whether you gave the raw materials for making the fire to bake the bread. Then he'll charge you less for the bread. Okay, there'll be a lower markup. So that's how they relate to that. Okay, the next thing you're going to start with for tomorrow, just to prepare you, is back to not how much is one meal and the difference between them, how much is a kikar. When we talk about an average size loaf, what do we mean, and how does this relate to other shiurim in halacha? Okay, have a Shabbat Shalom, everybody.